Session 7 has to do with the closing, and I've got to tell you, this is what we've all been waiting for. The closing is where everything comes together for the buyer and seller. It is a transfer of a deed for money, and obviously our hard work is finally paying off at this point. But what I want to talk to you about more than anything else are what are the things that we have to do in order to make sure that we have a smooth closing. There are a number of things that we have to do to first prepare for that closing. Contingencies have to be met. We have surveys that have to be done. We have inspections that have to be done. So there's a number of things, and we need a checklist to make sure that we take care of all those contingencies and get them out of the way. The next thing that we have to do is that we have to prepare to go to a closing. And what I want to say right now is that sometimes buyers and sellers may ask us to review closing documents, our closing disclosure forms, get our opinion if it's filled out right. I'm going to caution you about that. You can look at it, but my suggestion is let the title company explain to them what's going on to make sure that they get it right. You don't want that liability. Let me say this, though, about the closing and about different expenses and things that go on in a closing. On page 7-4, there's some information I think is going to be important and an easy way to remember what a closing is about. And oftentimes it has to do with one party paying another party. It's that final transaction where everything is settled. All of our monies are settled. And let's talk about the purchase price. As far as debits and credits are concerned, a debit is any time that we owe money, and a credit is any time that we receive money. So now let's talk about the closing statement, and let's talk about the purchase price. For the seller, the purchase price is going to be a credit. For the buyer, it's going to be a debit. In other words, it's money that the buyer is paying to the seller. The earnest money deposit. Now, I want you to think about this. The earnest money deposit was paid prior to closing. The closing statement and the day of closing only reflects one day. That deposit was made before that one day. And so therefore, that deposit was given to a broker or an agent, and they put it in escrow. On the day of closing, they're going to bring that money to closing. So therefore, that's money that the buyer has already paid. Therefore, the earnest money deposit will be a credit to the buyer. Mortgages, on the other hand, here's the way that I want you to view these. Mortgages, or loans, if you will, are monies that the buyer does not have to come up with at closing. They may have to pay it later, but not on the day of closing. And so all mortgages, as it relates to the closing, is going to be a credit to the buyer, and any mortgage dealing with a seller is going to be a debit to the seller. For the seller, it's money they're not getting. For the buyer, it's money they don't have to come up with. So mortgages are credits to buyers, debits to sellers. And also we have taxes, and an easy way to remember the taxes that are due on a closing. Anything having to do with the purchase price, like the doc stamps on the deed, typically the seller pays for. Anything having to do with a loan or the mortgage, the buyer pays for, such as the intangible tax on the mortgage or the documentary stamps on the promissory note. Those are all things paid by the buyer. And also any other fee that may accompany that loan that the lender is requiring the buyer is going to pay for. Those are considered to be expense items. Now, there may be some prorated items in there as well. Those prorated items are items that are shared between the buyer and seller. For instance, if it's a rental property and the closing is in the middle of the month, well, they're going to share that rent. And so it has to be prorated between the buyer and seller. Your post-closing task, obviously, you're going to end up showing up at the closing to pick up a check, to pick up your copy of the closing disclosure, and to get that back to the office. Once that's done, you need to write some thank you letters. Make sure that everybody knows that you appreciate them, and then you're going to get back to the office, wrap it up, put it to bed, and then move on to the next closing. And that's all I have for the closing section of this chapter. So what I want to do right now is give you a quick review of those areas of critical concern. On the closing disclosure, the binder will be a credit to the buyer. On the closing disclosure, all mortgages will be a credit to the buyer and a debit to the seller. Doc stamps on the deed are typically paid by the seller. Documentary stamps on the note, intangible tax on the mortgage, and the recording fee of the mortgage are typically paid by the buyer. And that's all we have on the closing section review.